Okay, here's a huge question. Why are some countries so incredibly rich while others just seem stuck in poverty? You might think it's about culture or maybe geography, right? But what if it's something else? What if the answer is buried in history? In this explainer, we're going to dig into that, and it all starts with a really fascinating historical puzzle.
So let's talk about the printing press. I mean, this thing changed everything. It was basically the internet of its day, right? It just unleashed this explosion of knowledge all across Europe. But here's the crazy part. One of the biggest, most powerful empires in the world at the time took one look at this game-changing tech and said, nope, we're banning it.
And I want you to really get a sense of how long this went on for. I mean, look at this timeline. Gutenberg's press kicks off in 1445. It spreads like wildfire. But then, in 1485, the Ottoman Sultan bans printing in Arabic, and that ban stays in place until 1727. That's almost 300 years. This wasn't some oversight, this was a conscious choice. So the question is, why on earth would they do that?
Well, the answer really comes down to one thing: who was in charge and what they were afraid of losing. For the Ottoman elite, this amazing new invention didn't look like an opportunity. It looked like a threat.
And just look at the consequences of that decision. I mean, the numbers here are just staggering. By 1800, you've got literacy in a place like England climbing up to 60% for men. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, it's stuck at around 2 or 3%. This isn't just about who can read. This is the seed of a huge economic divide. So, what were they thinking? Well, the Ottoman sultans and the whole religious establishment, they weren't stupid. They knew exactly what books do. They spread ideas. And you know what? A population with access to new ideas is a lot harder to control. They were terrified of losing their monopoly on information, because that's where their power came from. So their solution? Just ban the whole thing.
And here's the thing. This fear, it wasn't just about the printing press. Not at all. It's actually a key part of a much bigger pattern. It's a force that helps explain why some nations seem to actively choose to stay stagnant instead of moving forward. There's actually a name for this phenomenon. It's called creative destruction. And it's a pretty simple idea, really. Whenever a new technology or innovation comes along, it naturally replaces the old way of doing things. For society as a whole, that's awesome. That's progress. But if you're one of the elites whose power and wealth are all tied up in those old systems, well then creative destruction isn't progress. It's a direct threat to your entire world.
And this fear of change, it actually shapes the entire foundation of a society. You can really think of it as two different paths a country can go down. On one path, you have what are called inclusive institutions. These are systems that are designed to let lots of people participate. They protect your property, they uphold the law, they encourage anyone and everyone to innovate. But then there's the other path, extractive institutions. These are set up for one purpose: to suck wealth and power out of the country and funnel it to a tiny group at the top. And you can bet those elites will fight tooth and nail to keep that system going.
So you might be wondering, just how far will these elites go to protect themselves? Well, let's take a look. We're going to see how absolute rulers, we're talking kings and emperors with total power, literally try to stop the future in its tracks just to hold on to what they had.
Okay, get this. This quote from Francis I of Austria-Hungary, it just says it all. When he was asked about building railways, he wasn't worried about the cost. He wasn't worried about the engineering. No, he was worried that connecting his country would bring in revolutionary ideas. He literally saw a train and feared a revolution.
And he wasn't alone in thinking this way. Over in Russia, the finance minister had the same vibe. He complained that railways would encourage unnecessary travel. I mean, unnecessary travel. What's really behind that? The real fear was that if people could move around, they'd be a lot harder to control. You can't keep them tied to the land as serfs if they can just hop on a train. For these guys, mobility was a massive social threat.
And this pattern of blocking progress, it was everywhere you looked in these absolute estates. In Austria-Hungary, they banned new factories. In Russia, they choked off credit and limited factory growth. In China, during the Ming and Qing dynasties, they literally banned overseas trade. I mean, think about that. All of these decisions completely slammed the brakes on economic progress, and it was all for one reason: to protect the power of the guys at the top.
Okay, so it seems like having a state that's too powerful and too greedy is a huge problem, right? But what about the opposite extreme? What happens when there's no effective state at all? Well, that leads you into a completely different kind of dead end. Let's call it the chaos trap.
See, it turns out that for progress to happen, you don't just need freedom from a powerful oppressive ruler. You also need some basic rules of the road. You need a state that's at least strong enough to enforce laws, to make sure no one steals your stuff, and to provide some basic order. If you don't have that, you fall into a totally different kind of trap.
Just take a look at Somalia. Historically, for long periods, society there was organized around clans, with no real central government to settle arguments. And what was the result? Constant fighting over basic stuff like water and land. Now put yourself in that situation. Would you bother to build a new irrigation system or invent a better tool if you knew your neighbor could just come over and steal it or smash it tomorrow? Of course not. There's zero incentive to innovate or invest.
So what we're seeing here are two very different roads that both lead to the same destination: poverty. You can have a state that's way too strong and just crushes everything, or you can have a state that's too weak to even function. And the crazy thing is, the legacies of which path a country went down centuries ago are still shaping our world in huge ways today.
So let's just break it down one more time. On one side, you've got absolutism. The core problem is these extractive institutions, where the elites just actively block any innovation that threatens them. On the other side, you've got a lack of centralization, basically no state at all. Here, the problem is you can't enforce laws or protect property, so nobody invests. Either way, you get stagnation. It seems like real prosperity requires this tricky balance, right? You need a state that's strong enough to keep order, but not so strong that it can just take whatever it wants. And then the Industrial Revolution happened. You can think of this as a massive fork in the road for humanity. The countries that had those inclusive institutions, they just took off like a rocket. But the ones with the extractive institutions, whether they were too strong or too weak, they got left in the dust. And those small differences that had been bubbling under the surface for centuries, suddenly they exploded into the huge, massive gap between rich and poor countries that we see all around us today.
And I mean, the consequences are just mind-blowing. Let's take Ethiopia, a country with a very long history of exactly these kinds of extractive, absolutist institutions. Today, the average person there earns just 1/40th of what the average person in England earns. 1/40th. That's not a small gap. That is the incredibly long shadow that history can cast. Which really brings us to a final, pretty provocative thought. This whole story, it's not just ancient history. This fear of creative destruction, this impulse to block change to protect the powerful, it's absolutely still with us. So that leaves us with a big question to chew on. What are the printing presses and the railways of today? What are the game-changing innovations that are being held back right now? And more importantly, whose power do they threaten?